There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a funeral. It doesn't have a date on a calendar or a grave to visit. It's the grief of a living absence, someone who is still in the world somewhere but not in yours. Keisha Monroe had carried that grief for 18 years. 18 years of birthdays her mother never called. 18 years of milestones she had celebrated in silence, telling herself each time that this was the year she would stop waiting. She had stopped waiting, or so she believed. When Keisha walked onto the Family Feud stage that afternoon in October, she walked on as a woman who had made peace with the story she had been given. She was 31 years old, composed, successful, loved. She had built a full life without the woman who was supposed to be its foundation. What she had not built, what no amount of discipline or determination could fully close, was the space where her mother was supposed to be. Steve Harvey would see it the moment she stepped to the podium. And before that hour was over, he would say two words that would change everything. Turn around. Keisha Monroe grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, the oldest of two children raised by her father, Earl Monroe, a transit worker who ran his household with love and schedule and the quiet authority of a man who showed up every single day without exception. Earl was not a dramatic man. He did not complain. He made Keisha's lunch before school, attended every parent-teacher conference, and sat in the bleachers at every track meet even when it rained. He never spoke poorly about Keisha's mother, Sandra, in front of the children. He would simply say she had her own struggles, said in the measured tone of a man who had decided long ago that bitterness was a luxury he couldn't afford when two children needed raising. Sandra Monroe had left when Keisha was 13. There had been warning signs, long absences, phone calls that went unanswered, the specific look on her father's face when he hung up the phone and said nothing. Then one morning Sandra was simply not there. She had packed a bag and moved in with a boyfriend in another city. She called twice in the first year. Then the calls stopped entirely. Keisha was a teenager who became very good at being fine. She channeled everything into track, then into academics, then into a nursing degree from the University of Maryland. She graduated with honors. She got a job at Johns Hopkins Hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse, caring, with tremendous gentleness, for children in their most vulnerable moments. Her colleagues called her unshakable. Her patients' families trusted her completely. She was 31 now, engaged to a man named Daryl who had proposed at her family's Thanksgiving table with her father watching and trying not to cry. Their wedding was 7 months away. In the 18 years since her mother had left, Keisha had received one letter. It arrived when Keisha was 22, postmarked from somewhere in Georgia. Sandra had written that she was sorry, that she had problems she didn't know how to face, that she loved Keisha and always had. She had not included a return address. Keisha had read that letter 4 times. Then she had put it in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet where it had stayed ever since. She had not written back. She told herself it was because there was no return address. But the truth, which she admitted only to Daryl in quiet moments, was simpler than that. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know whether she wanted the door open or shut. And after 18 years, she wasn't sure there was still a door. What Keisha did not know on the afternoon of the Family Feud taping was that the shoebox was not the end of the story. The Monroe family came to Family Feud as a 5-person team. Keisha, her father Earl, her younger brother Darius, her fiancé Daryl, and her Aunt Roberta, Earl's sister, a retired schoolteacher who had been the family's backbone during the hardest years. Roberta was 70 years old, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and answered Steve Harvey's pre-game banter with the kind of sharp, dignified wit that made the audience immediately love her. The family was warm and cohesive and full of the easy shorthand of people who had weathered something real together. Steve Harvey noticed it immediately. He had been doing this long enough to recognize the difference between families who were performing togetherness and families who simply had it. Rose had it. During the pre-game interview segment, Steve worked the family with his usual instincts, asking Earl how long he'd been married, then watching the slight recalibration in the family's posture when Earl gently clarified that he was single, had been for a long time, that it was just him and the kids and Roberta. Steve registered that. He filed it away. He turned to Keisha. "You're getting married soon?" 7 months, Keisha said, smiling. "You excited about the wedding?" "Incredibly." "Your mom going to be there?" Steve asked, conversationally lightly, the way he sometimes slipped in a question that was actually a scalpel. The pause that followed was a fraction of a second too long. Keisha kept her smile in place. "My family will be there," she said, careful, practiced. Steve moved on, but he had heard the answer. The Monroe family played the main game with tremendous energy. Earl was unexpectedly quick on the buzzer. Darius got the audience laughing twice. Keisha was focused and precise, the same qualities that made her good at her job surfacing clearly under pressure. When they won the main game and headed to fast money, the audience was completely behind them. Keisha went first for fast money. She approached the podium with the steady stride of someone who had learned to walk into hard rooms without flinching. She answered all 5 questions quickly and cleanly. When the scores were revealed, she had earned 161 points, an outstanding first-round score. Darius went second. He was less polished but hit 2 strong answers. When the final count landed at 196 points, they had won. The Monroe family celebrated the way families do when something good happens after something long and hard, not just with joy, but with relief. Earl had his arm around Keisha's shoulder, and she leaned into him in the instinctive way of a daughter who has known since 13 that this was the parent who stayed. Steve Harvey let the celebration settle. Then he walked back to center stage and stood very still. The audience sensed the shift. "Before we wrap up," Steve said quietly, "I need to address something." He looked at Keisha directly. "I asked you a question earlier about your mother, and you answered it with grace. But I'm a man who's learned to pay attention, and what you said told me something." Keisha looked at him steadily. Her father's arm tightened slightly around her shoulder. "Can I ask you something honest?" Steve said. "What happened with your mom?" Keisha held his gaze for a moment. Darryl, standing to her left, reached over and took her hand. She looked at her father, who gave her the same expression he had always given her, "I've got you, whatever you need." "She left when I was 13, Keisha said. "I got one letter when I was 22, no return address. I haven't heard from her since." "Do you know where she is now?" Another pause. "No," Keisha said. "I stopped trying to find out." "Do you want to?" Steve asked. The question landed with weight. Keisha opened her mouth, then closed it again. The studio was quiet in the specific way that happens when something true is about to be said. "I don't know," she said finally. I think I stopped letting myself want that." Steve nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "I understand protecting yourself from wanting something that might hurt you. I've done it too." He paused. "But Keisha, what if wanting it wasn't going to hurt you this time?" Nobody in the studio audience knew what was happening in the production booth. 3 weeks before the taping, a woman named Sandra Monroe had called the Family Feud producers. She had been watching old episodes compulsively, the way people do when they are trying to summon the courage for something enormous, and she had somehow found a contact number for contestant outreach. She explained who she was. She explained what she had done 18 years ago. She explained that she had been in recovery from addiction for the past 11 years, that the problems Earl Monroe had alluded to in careful, diplomatic language had been severe and consuming, and that the person who had packed that bag when Keisha was 13 had been in the grip of something she could not, at the time, control. She had been clean for 11 years. She had been in therapy. She had rebuilt her life in Savannah, Georgia, where she worked as an addiction counselor, helping other people fight the same battle she had fought. She had thought about her daughter every day. She had written that letter at 22 because she had finally gotten sober enough to form the words, but she had not included a return address because she was terrified of the answer. When she heard that Keisha Monroe, her daughter's full, unmistakable name, had been selected as a Family Feud contestant, she had taken it as a sign. She had called, she had explained everything to the producers, she had asked humbly if there was any possibility. The producers had done what responsible producers do. They had spoken with Earl Monroe privately before the taping. He had listened. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "That is Keisha's choice to make, not mine. But I won't be the one to stop it." They had asked Keisha's Aunt Roberta. Roberta had said, "If Sandra has truly changed, then my niece deserves to know that. If she hasn't, Keisha is strong enough to handle it. She always has been." They had not asked Keisha, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is trust that they are ready, even before they know it themselves. Sandra was in the building. Steve Harvey knew. He looked at Keisha now and said, gently but clearly, "I want you to know that there are people who love you in this room, your father, Darryl, your whole family. They are all behind you right now. Whatever happens in the next 30 seconds, you are not alone." Keisha's eyes had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone who has understood what is coming before it arrives. "Keisha," Steve said, "turn around." She turned. Sandra Monroe was standing at the edge of the stage. She was 54 years old, small-framed, with Keisha's cheekbones and Keisha's eyes made older. She was not performing. She was simply standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face entirely open, no preparation, no script, just a woman who had walked through her own wreckage and arrived, after 18 years, at the only place she had ever truly wanted to be. For 3 full seconds, Keisha did not move. The studio was silent in a way that studios almost never are, not the silence of people holding their breath for entertainment, but the silence of 200 strangers witnessing something irreducibly private and real. Then Keisha's composure, so carefully built, so faithfully maintained since she was 13 years old, broke. Not violently, not in collapse. It broke the way a dam breaks when it is held exactly as long as it was supposed to and the water finally gets through. She crossed the stage. Sandra met her halfway. The embrace that followed was the kind that doesn't look like television. It was not graceful. It was not beautiful in any choreographed sense. It was two people holding on with everything they had, the specific grip of someone returning and someone who had been waiting without admitting they were waiting. Earl Monroe stood with his head down and his hand pressed to his mouth. Darius had his arm around his father's shoulders. Daryl stood a few steps back, giving his fiancée the space the moment required. Aunt Roberta looked at Steve Harvey. Steve Harvey looked at Aunt Roberta. She gave him a single nod that contained an entire decade of prayer. Steve Harvey stepped back. He did not speak for almost a full minute, an eternity in television. When he did speak, his voice was quiet and measured. 18 years, he said. 18 years of distance, and it took one afternoon for God to say, it's time, it's time. He paused. Keisha, I don't know everything your mother has been through. I don't know all of what you've carried, but I know this. That woman walked into this building today not knowing if you would turn around. She came anyway. That took something real. Another pause. And you turned around. That took something real too. The episode aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, the clip had been viewed 22 million times. What spread faster than the clip, however, was the story behind it. When the full context emerged, Sandra's addiction, her recovery, her 11 years of rebuilding, her work as an addiction counselor in Savannah, the response from viewers was not simple. It was complicated, and that complication was what made it matter. People argued in comment sections about whether Sandra deserved forgiveness. People shared their own stories of mothers who had left, fathers who had left, the particular mathematics of absence and return. People who were estranged from their own children wrote in asking how to take the first step. People who had been left by parents as children wrote in to say that watching Keisha turn around had finally, for the first time, made them believe it was possible for them too. Sandra and Keisha did not have an instant, frictionless reunion. Neither of them pretended otherwise. They were careful with each other in the early months, phone calls first, then an afternoon coffee in Baltimore, then a weekend where Sandra met Daryl and sat at Earl Monroe's kitchen table for the first time in 18 years. That was the hardest day. Earl was gracious and quiet, the same qualities that had defined his entire approach to a situation that would have broken lesser people. He shook Sandra's hand. He made coffee. He excused himself after an hour and let his daughter have the time she needed. What Sandra and Keisha found over the following months was not the relationship they would have had if none of this had happened. That relationship was gone. It existed only in an alternate version of a life that Keisha had not been given. What they found instead was something built on the truth of what had actually occurred. Sandra was honest about the depth of her addiction, the choices she had made inside it, and the years of work she had done to become someone different. Keisha was honest about the damage, not to punish, but because she was a woman who had learned, both through her own life and through her work with children, that healing requires accuracy. You cannot mend something whose shape you are unwilling to name. 7 months after the taping, Keisha Monroe married Daryl at a venue in Baltimore with 200 guests. Her father walked her down the aisle. Aunt Roberta sat in the front row with a tissue tucked into the collar of her dress. In the third row in a pale blue dress sat Sandra Monroe. She did not walk Keisha down the aisle. That was Earl's place and always would be. But she was there. She watched her daughter become a wife, and she wept with the specific grief and gratitude of someone who had almost missed it entirely, who had in fact missed almost everything, and understood with complete clarity what that had cost. Keisha had asked her to come. She had made that choice freely, without anyone's pressure, 6 weeks before the wedding. She had called Sandra on a Tuesday evening and said, "I want you there, not because everything is fixed, but because I'm done letting the past make choices about my future." Sandra had been unable to speak for nearly a minute. Then she had said, "Thank you." 2 words, nothing else. They were enough. Steve Harvey learned about the wedding through a message Keisha sent to the show's production team. He responded personally. He wrote that he thought about that afternoon often, that it was one of the moments he returned to when the work of hosting became routine, a reminder of what the platform was actually for. At her hospital in Baltimore, Keisha began doing something she had not done before. When she sat with parents of her pediatric patients, parents who were frightened, exhausted, sometimes broken by what they were facing, she started sharing, in brief and careful ways, the fact that she had grown up without her mother. Not as a performance, not as a script, simply as a signal that she was a person who understood what it was to carry something heavy and that she was still standing. Several families told her afterward that it had helped them more than anything clinical she had said. Sandra, for her part, incorporated Keisha's story into the work she did with her clients in Savannah, specifically with parents in recovery who had estranged children. She would tell them that the door did not have to be permanently closed, that it required humility, patience, and the willingness to show up without guarantees, that sometimes the path back took 18 years and arrived in a television studio in Atlanta and started with a woman on a stage who had spent half her life protecting herself from a hope she had not dared to name. 2 years after the taping, Keisha gave birth to her first child, a daughter. She named her Evelyn after her father's sister, the woman who had stood in every gap and held every peace. Sandra Monroe was in the waiting room when Evelyn was born. She was the second person after Earl to hold the baby. She held her for a long time and said nothing. Then she looked at Keisha and said in a voice very quiet, "She has your eyes." Keisha looked at her daughter and then at her mother. "She has yours too," she said. That exchange was not on television. It was not viewed 22 million times. It did not trend or circulate or become a symbol of anything. It was simply a moment between two women in a hospital room, one who had come back and one who had let her, and a new life just beginning, carrying in her face the evidence that the story was still going. If there is a lesson in all of it, and lessons are imperfect things, always smaller than the experiences they try to describe, it may be this: the people who guard their hearts most carefully are often the people with the most capacity for love. They guard because they know what love costs when it is taken away. Keisha Monroe had guarded faithfully for 18 years, and when Steve Harvey said turn around, she turned, not because she had forgotten the cost, but because she had finally decided it was worth paying again. If this story touched you, like it and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this.